Good evening. Hi, welcome. Welcome to all of our in-person and virtual attendees to what is going to be a really exciting lecture by Dr. Nina Horisaki-Christens. We're delighted to have you here. Welcome. A few items of housekeeping before I get into our introductions for tonight. Please take a moment to silence all of your cell phones and devices right now. Also, please hold your questions till the end. We'll leave a few minutes at the end of the talk to take questions from the audience. Also, if you need to leave during the program, we ask that you use the doors at the back of our auditorium to prevent disruption during the talk. My name is Lana Metter, and I am the Associate Curator for Modern and Contemporary Art here at the museum. And I'm delighted to welcome our speaker and have this program tonight in association with our presentation of teamLab, the World of Irreversible Change. teamLab is an international art collective that was formed in Tokyo in 2001. Their collaborative practice seeks to navigate the confluence of art, science, technology, and the natural world. The World of Irreversible Change presents a digital world across 6 monitors and resembles the format of historic Japanese screens, such as Sama's 17th century Edo period screen, which is also on view in the gallery, scenes in and around Tokyo. The teamLab work is on generous loan from the Carl and Marilynn Thoma Foundation, so we're really grateful that they have agreed to share this incredible piece of art with our community. And it will be on view in our Contemporary 2 gallery through March 23rd of 2025. Now, this artwork changes in real time with the seasons, weather, time of day, as the place it's being displayed. So in this case, it will change with all of these things in San Antonio. So I invite you to come back and visit us often, and each time you'll have a different experience with the artwork. Now, our galleries will be closed at 7 o'clock when the talk ends tonight, but we'll reopen tomorrow at 10, and you'll have until March of 2025 to enjoy this incredible artwork by teamLab. I'd also like to acknowledge my collaborators on this installation, Dr. Emily Sano and Sean Yuan, who are former curators of Asian art here at SAMA. They helped to present this work in context with our historic Japanese screen. I also want to thank the Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Fund, which makes programs like this at the museum possible. So thanks so much for your generosity. Now to introduce our esteemed speaker. Nina Horisaki-Christens received her PhD from the Department of Art, History, and Archaeology and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University in 2021. With a concentration on Japanese art history. Her research focuses on the intersection of art, media, urbanism, translation, and social engagement in Japan, Asia, and the Asian diaspora. She has done extensive work in research in Japan, including as a 2017 Fulbright Graduate Research Fellow, in 2017 to 2019 as a visiting scholar at Sophia University's Institute for Comparative Culture in Tokyo. And in 2021, she worked with Collaborative Cataloging Japan on an Asian Cultural Council-funded research and preservation initiative entitled Interrogating Ecology, 1970s Media and Art in Japan. She also has museum experience, which includes as an assistant curator and programs manager at Art in General in New York, as a curatorial fellow in the Whitney Museum's Independent Study Program, also assisting with Japan Society's 2019 exhibition Made in Tokyo, Architecture and Living, 1964-2020, and as a research assistant for the Guggenheim Museum in New York and their exhibition Gutai, Splendid Playground. She also is a prolific writer and has contributed texts and translations to many publications, including those with the Museum of Modern Art, the Mori Art Museum, Hyperallergic, among many others. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Getty Research Institute, and we're delighted she's here with us in San Antonio and will share her insights on teamLab and media in Japan. Thank you so much.
everyone. I want to start by thanking, well, all of you for coming here today, and the San Antonio Museum of Art, and especially Dr. Emily Sano, Trip Cardiff, and Lena Medor for inviting me to speak on this work and its place within the overlapping context of contemporary art, Japanese art, and media art histories. As an art historian whose work focuses on experimental art and its intersection with art institutions, and media forms in and beyond Asia, I've long been aware of teamLab's practice, though I've not worked with them directly. This presentation, then, is intended to help place their work in several of its possible contexts from a third-party perspective. So World of Irreversible Change presents a wall-sized, glowing, animated window onto a cityscape filled with architecture, figures, and attire ranging from the historical to the fantastical. While clearly referencing art forms, famous artworks, architectural forms, and urban festivals that are appropriate to pre-Meiji Japan, this is pre-1868, the actual form of the work, which is a digital animation rendered in an almost wireframe style, displayed on high-resolution screens, reads as at least cutting edge, if not futuristic. Time is further confused by the sometimes relatively modern dress of certain figures, the occasional Western-style horse-drawn buggy, and man-sized standing frogs who seem drawn out by the rain. Initially, we might wonder at the seeming anachronism of rendering a scene reminiscent of the Edo period, which is 1685 to 1868, albeit a fantastical Edo period, in a format predominantly used to portray Kyoto and through a medium appropriate to the digital age. Is this simply an attempt to revamp historical art for a contemporary audience, or can we take something more away from this work and teamLab's practice more generally? To help us think through this question, I invite you to think with me about this work through three different frames. As a media form intimately connected to Japanese urbanism, as a part of history of change and chance in international media art, and as a format to encourage new forms of collectivity and interaction beyond the conventional art museum. For any of us who have spent time learning the history of early modern art from the region known today as Japan, viewing World of Irreversible Change will immediately bring to mind the richly decorated folding screens of the Azuchi Momoyama and early Edo periods, with their gold leaf clouds and horizontal bird's eye views. Certainly, directly referencing and pulling imagery or formats from historical and especially pre-Meiji Japanese art and visual culture is a familiar strategy in post-World War II Japanese art. In fact, teamLab's US Museum debut, as part of the three-person show Garden of Unearthly Delights at Japan Society in 2014, highlighted artists, namely Ikeda Manabu, Tenmyoya Hisashi, and teamLab, with the specific works that you see up here, whose works incorporated motifs, forms, and formats from early modern and medieval Japanese art, as you see here. But looking to Japan's past as an alternative to Western modernity, in other words, looking to an alternative modernist inheritance in Japan's pre-Meiji past, is a recurring theme within modern, but especially post-World War II art by those who identify in some way with being Japanese. Okamoto Taro, the de facto godfather of Japanese contemporary art, who studied in surrealist circles in 1930s France, infamously theorized the Jomon prehistoric culture with its exuberant ceramic forms, and you can see one of those forms up in the Japanese galleries here, as a model for an indigenous avant-garde modernist art. Drawing on the seeming vitality of a prehistoric aesthetic, Okamoto sought to oppose the refinement and control associated with wabi, sabi, and other aesthetic principles that had been promoted by the Japanese wartime regime and esteemed by Western modernism with its Enlightenment principles. To look to Jomon aesthetics, then, was to bypass the West's claim to modernism through an adamantly non-Western source and to respond to the politics of his immediate post-World War II context. This model repeats with Murakami Takashi's Superflat, which is particularly interested in Edo period models of eccentricity and flatness in relation to anime and its attendant fan cultures, or Tenmyoya Hisashi's Basara, which posits the extravagance and destructiveness of warring states Japanese culture as resonating with the post-apocalyptic aspects of contemporary society. So just to give you a little bit of a taste, this is the actual catalog for Murakami Takashi's Superflat, and this is the catalog for Basara, which sort of outlines the concepts that they have for what these models represent. Founded in 2001, teamLab's practice has developed roughly parallel with Murakami's Superflat, which was first articulated in 2000, and Tenmyoya's Basara, which was posited in 2009. My apologies. Apologies about that. While teamLab as an international collective includes artists in other cultural and geographical contexts, the core visual strategies of teamLab seem driven by founder Inoko Toshiyuki's concern with contemporary, digitally influenced experiences of spatiality. Through the term ultra-subjective space, teamLab proposes the multiple shifting viewpoints found within pre-Meiji forms of Japanese visual culture as a model for the ways contemporary individuals can navigate the mix of games, screens, data, and other digital modalities in an embodied way. As film and visual cultural historian Laura Lee writes, ultra-subjective space reinterprets traditional ways of depicting space by generating play between flatness and dimensionality that fosters immersion in the image as it enables the viewer to assume multiple shifting viewpoints. This mobile and mutable positioning brings the viewer into the artwork, forging continuity and interrelationality between the viewer and the world of the image. For teamLab, this compositional structure interrupts viewers' habitual relationships with images and, in turn, conventional, and here I would just add also the mathematical linear perspective, influenced ways of seeing and thinking, which it contrasts with pre-modern visuality and ancient modes of seeing through frequent visual citations of traditional Japanese art. Also, ultra-subjective space thus reanimates the Japanese past in the global digital present, correlating a dynamic and embodied engagement with the image with renewed relations between oneself and the world, end quote. As Lee articulates so well, teamLab's ultra-subjective space posits the mathematically derived model of linear perspective, which you see over here, which assumes a singular perspective associated with visual and civilizational mastery as insufficient for the complex embodied visual experiences of post-digital life. Instead, the hybridized and multiple perspectives found in pre-Meiji, therefore ostensibly pre-Western influence and pre-linear perspective, visual forms of Japan, including hand scrolls, hanging scrolls, painted screens, and ukiyo-e prints, serve as sources for replicating a mobile eye, encountering hybridized spaces with both flattened and dimensional imagery. And so these are just two of many different examples of what that kind of visuality can look like, that incorporate not linear, but other kinds of perspective. This doesn't ever recede to a particular point. And over here, we have shifting viewpoints that happen throughout the space to the point that we actually can't quite tell what's going on up here with this cliff-like projection. But while Okamoto and Murakami clearly look to the past as a point of origin for overcoming the dominance of Western models of art making and institutional art forms, Inoko founded teamLab as part of his response to the dominance of Western paradigms of vision in physics, technology, and engineering during his college studies. Japanese art is thus a way of pushing against the Enlightenment model of space and spatial visualization in and beyond art that Inoko and other members of teamLab see as inadequate to the problems of mediation and embodiment in the digital age. Interestingly, Inoko's experiences of the urban space of Tokyo are closely linked to his awareness of mediation. As art historian Karen Owen notes, quote, prior to living in Tokyo, his impressions of that city were largely mediated by photography, television, and film, not real lived experiences. His awareness of his own constructed impressions of Tokyo was made even more keen by his vivid memories of his childhood in Tokushima, where he felt he was part of the landscape rather than an observer, end quote. In fact, some of the core issues of teamLab's practice, namely connectedness, overcoming borders, and experiencing the real continuity of human and natural realms, are exacerbated by the nature of urban space, dominated as it is by human constructions. It is perhaps not by chance that the majority of teamLab's immersive experiences are in urban centers like Tokyo, Osaka, Beijing, Singapore, Abu Dhabi, Jeddah, Macau, and Shenzhen. It is in such sites filled with media from screens and billboards to mirror-clad architecture and glass store windows that the impact of mediated experiences is most keenly felt and most intimately tied to the establishment of borders and boundaries. World of Irreversible Change's form makes explicit this link to urban space, replicating the six-panel composition, golden clouds, and cityscape of a historical Raku-raku byobu, or folding screen depicting scenes in and around the capital. The best-known examples of Raku-raku were made in the Azuchi Momoyama period during the political upheavals that led to the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate and initiated the Edo period. Although typically depicting the old capital of Kyoto, Raku-raku are the prototypical example of how urban space was depicted prior to the Meiji period, including famous urban sites, a progression of seasons across a screen pair indicated by elements of nature and seasonal festivals, and a cross-section of urban character types from various classes depicted from bird's eye view. Although the screens themselves were commissioned and viewed by aristocrats, they first appear in parallel with a time of robust urban construction and upheaval, and their popularity in the 17th century coincided with the emergence of a robust popular culture that flourished under Tokugawa rule during the 17th to 19th centuries. Art historian Matthew McElway writes that, quote, Kyoto's streets are alive in these paintings with the everyday activities of thousands of people, members of all classes and people of diverse professions are distributed evenly across the various scenes of the painting. Nowhere do they assemble in threatening numbers or pause from their busy lives. Suspended in matrices of abstracted space and cyclical time, the images of Kyoto in Raku-raku screens possess an eternal, almost paradisiacal quality, end quote. It was this quality that lent them visual interest, depicting everyone from the aristocratic samurai class through the working class shokunin across their various daily and yearly activities to create a dynamic but also well-ordered, cohesive, peaceful urban society. Humor and entertainment are depicted specifically to provide entertainment and assurance to the assumed voyeuristic gaze of the aristocracy. These depictions of daily life became models for other kinds of genre painting and, in turn, eventually for more popular visual media that developed as forms of urban entertainment, things like ukiyo-e prints and magic lantern slides in the later Edo period. The emergence of mass cultural forms associated with urban space is also closely associated with trying to find ways of characterizing that space at scale through visualizations, mapping, statistics, and data that eventually lead us to the digital moment. Both grounded in concrete details and abstracted as idealized ageographical representations in which certain real distances and spans of time are elided through the intervention of gold clouds. Raku-raku share with digital algorithmic analysis a condensation of abstraction of certain kinds of supposedly meaningful concrete information, things like weather, population, demographics, and change over time. And this is in service of the modeling of an idealized version of a site. Such a perspective on the meaning of Raku-raku arises in the heated media theory context of the 1960s and 1970s, when the information society developed from that era's emphasis on white-collar employment, service-based economies, and computer technologies in the US, in Japan, and in other economically advanced countries. Artist Yamaguchi Katsuhiro, who was a former member of the 1950s technological art collective Jiken Kobo, or Experimental Workshop, continued to experiment with and promote media technology in art until his death in 2018. His own work continually returned to a triangulation between the experiences of urban space, with their reflective surfaces, screen-like forms, and saturation of text and images, along with emerging technologies from auto-synchronized slideshows to digital video, and art as an accessible practice of exchange that should be open to the participation of non-specialists and focused on processes of communication. So this is the background for how he works in a media art context, even before the start of media art proper. Writing in 1977, Yamaguchi specifically likens raku-raku to misemono, or popular urban attractions that most people can enjoy not only as a documentary of the lives of people in the past, but as an object that spurs discussion from observation, or in other words, as a communications media. Yamaguchi further argues that the gold clouds, with their role of both isolating close-up scenes and also bridging both time and space between different scenes in a non-linear, montage-like form, are particularly modern in their function, in tune with other contemporary moving image and electronic media. In fact, likening raku-raku to communications and information media continues in more contemporary moments as well. Details about the various characters, architecture, and scenes in the Uesugi raku-raku screens were converted into an interactive CD-ROM database in 2001 by publisher Shogakukan. The logic behind making such a database was that the great amount of detail of the raku-raku made these paintings into an exemplary documentary form from which historians and lay people could learn about the past, essentially treating the painting as a visual database. Such a perspective also lies behind more recent efforts, such as the collaborative experiments of Toppan Publishing and the Tokyo National Museum that's been on view seasonally since 2021, where they created 4K images and a guided virtual reality experience of the Funaki raku-raku screens as a way of bringing the information in the screens to life, treating them as an educational tool for understanding history. Thus, if the World of Irreversible Change recalls the format of the raku-raku, there is already a logic embedded within Japanese media discourse for understanding this form as communications and information media linked to a history of digitization and datification since the early years of media art. But Yamaguchi's observation about the montage-like nature of these screens also points to the importance of time in raku-raku, expressed through changes in time of day and season across such screens. Such change is key to the vision of teamLab's The World of Irreversible Change as well. In fact, change is a key concept for media art as a field. Even prior to the emergence of such a term in the 1980s, precursors for media art can be found in the experimental arts movements of the 1960s and 70s, including intermedia, fluxus, expanded cinema, performance art, and early video practices. Many of the artists working in and across these genres sought to invite viewer participation and look to John Cage's ideas of chance and contingency as a model for incorporating interactivity into the space of art. Composing by the use of chance operations and directing performers by using scores that were non-conventional, then leaving the interpretation of how to read and perform these scores up to each performer or audience member, the score became an object of interaction. The work of art was only completed when the score was interpreted, and thus the artwork became as flexible as the imaginations of those who chose to interact with the score. Those artists of the 1960s and 1970s who were opposed to the perceived exclusivity and elitism of fine art spaces looked to interactivity as a way of opening up and democratizing art on two fronts. First, by shifting the materials and media of art to incorporate more accessible materials familiar to many potential audience members from daily life. And here we might think of pop art and junk art's incorporation of newspapers, packaging, logos, stickers, and machine components. And then secondly, by using these materials in scenarios that would be completed by processes that included viewer participation, as well as the participation of non-human processes beyond human control, so natural, mechanical, and electronic processes. The visual materials and elements of the work of art were thus conceived as welcoming of broader audiences unfamiliar with the specific histories of fine art, but familiar with the languages of material culture simply by dint of being citizens of the world. At the same time, the authority of the artist as author was diminished, flattening the hierarchical relationship usually established by a master artist presenting work in an authoritative institution that provides an officially sanctioned valuation of the work to present to an uneducated mass audience. This vision of art as a site of interaction and change drew on ideas articulated by Walter Benjamin in his infamous essay of 1935, first translated into English in 1968, so just at this media art development moment, on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. In this essay, Benjamin discusses how the loss of aura, or the sense of authenticity and authority created by unique works of art, under conditions of mechanical reproduction, changes the politics and potential audiences for images through new image media like the cinema. If the work of art confined audiences to reverence and contemplation, cinema functioned more like play, and as Miriam Hansen has argued in her analysis of Benjamin's writings, as a play form of technology, entailing interaction between audience and image in a public space, often using themes and imagery familiar from the alienating and wearying experiences of industrialized and mechanized modernity. The cinema was, for Benjamin, a site in which mass publics could work out the emotional and sensorial effects of the modern world playfully. While Benjamin sensed both a possibility for numbing desensitization and playful liberation within this site of cinema, it was, in either case, a site that denied the separateness of art from life, a proposition on which fine art and art patronage was established, because of this potential for play and thus for change. In the interactive model of art making, the work of art is not static, created by an author and consumed by a merely receptive audience. Rather, art is a set of conditions created by the artist, but the artwork is only completed once audience members participate, and the work is completed multiple times by various audience members to different effect. Change is potentially infinite and built into the structure of the work of art itself. As artists sought ever more flexible means for incorporating change and process into the space of art, they sometimes looked to technology as a tool for incorporating chance and unpredictability, making scenarios that were contingent upon viewers' actions or environmental conditions that were often outside of conscious rational control of both artist and audience. For example, in Carolee Schneemann's 1967 performance work Snows, audience seats were outfitted with contact microphones linked to light and motor systems that changed conditions on the stage where the performers were interacting with projections, lights, and props. In a different direction of proto-media art, starting in 1970, Nakaya Fujiko's fog sculptures used high-tech pressurized misting systems to create water particles fine enough to form a visible fog and light enough to interact with local atmospheric conditions and movements of visitors, making visible and sensible, through the cold, damp sensation of the mist, the human-nature interactions within a given space. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, groups like Dumbtype were incorporating digitized data and computer control into immersive interactive spaces to consider questions of choice, identity, control, and alienation. Dumbtype member Furuhashi Teiji's Lovers, a 1994 video installation in which life-size projections of members of the group walk in a choreographed way around a darkened gallery space, occasionally accompanied by text and moving crosshairs, is interrupted and modulated by audience movements that trigger sensors, and also by audience members' bodies that interrupts the projections. Yet, Just as the projected bodies themselves never make direct contact, sliding over each other, the audience and projection similarly interact only through movement and light. teamLab's works pick up on the theme of change and contingency as a means of enlivening and expanding the work of art. In immersive installations like Flowers and People, Gold and Dark of 2012, projections of flowers bleed out of the frame of a screen to spill across the walls and floor of a darkened space. As viewers move within these immersive projections, the depicted flowers blossom and wither in response to viewers' movements, controlled by sensors that feed movement data to a computer that generates images anew based off of the sensor data. The combined effects of the movements of multiple viewers in this space lead to a constantly shifting composition that is said never to repeat, just as nature is always shifting, albeit usually in less immediately perceptible ways, in reaction to our movements and interaction. Yet in the space of the world of irreversible change, viewer interaction is decidedly different. We don't see any immediate way to influence the world depicted on the screens, but changes in weather, sunrise, and sunset are all synchronized with our own space, and this signals to us a connection between our current time and location and the world depicted on the screens. The degree to which these worlds are linked is unclear, and the specific method by which we can influence this digital world is left to viewer experimentation. But as we watch festivals emerge, arguments break out, and other human actions develop from the combination of natural and artificial conditions programmed into this world, we're left to hypothesize as to the degree our own actions might influence the at times peaceful and at times cataclysmic events depicted in the world of irreversible change. What we do know is that the imagery that spills across the scenes is modulated by real-time environmental data about seasons and weather conditions, both locally and at unspecified sites. This complex set of real-time data then generates responses in the virtual world of the screens, including agitation and destruction, fires and regrowth, as well as festivals, daily life, and work cycles. But while regrowth and reconstruction are built into the cycles depicted in the world of irreversible change, it's never the same, and in teamLab's words, quote, "The world from before can never be returned to," end quote. This makes concrete a Buddhist truism woven throughout pre-Meiji cultural forms in Japan about human impermanence and the unceasing nature of change. Encapsulated by the term mono no aware, literally the pathos of things, this sensitivity towards cyclical and impermanent experiences of happiness, pain, and life is central to Japanese Buddhist thought, and a key reason we find scrolls and screens incorporating multiple seasons into a single frame. It's also why ephemeral imagery, like colored leaves and falling cherry blossoms, serve as favorite motifs in Japanese classical literature and material culture. The incorporation of such imagery, even into the urban site of Rakuchu Rakugaizu, further points to the inseparability of human and natural realms, also central to Buddhist theology and Shinto beliefs, but also an idea that resonates with contemporary scientific knowledge about the effects of human change on Earth's ecology and our local ecosystems. While artists like Miyajima Tatsuo have used media art methods, in Miyajima's case hundreds or thousands of asynchronous digital counters that count ceaselessly, to explore such themes since the 1980s, works on impermanence and ceaseless change have found a particular resurgence in the post-Tohoku earthquake Japanese art scene, so post-2011, as the contingency of contemporary lifestyles was thrown into stark relief by the damage of the resulting tsunami and nuclear meltdown. Takeda Shinpei's constellation-like photo series documents, through photographic exposures of irradiated soil, the continued impacts of the nuclear meltdown on the natural environment, while Reiko Shiga's haunting, surrealistic images documenting the life of a small village in the Tohoku coast, both pre- and post-earthquake, position the disaster as part of larger cycles of change and loss. But themes of impermanence are also in tune with contemporary art discourses on the international scene that seek ways of making tangible and comprehensible the immense changes being wrought on our climate and environment by human action. Artists such as Olafur Eliasson, Annika Yi, and Semiconductor look for ways to decenter the human perspective in favor of atmospheric, microbiological, or geological time. This is one of the curious effects of the visual perspective created by the World of Irreversible Change within teamLab's larger body of work. Rather than simply immersive, the framed bird's eye view that mimics the Raku-raku screens provides a model of our own world in miniature, removed in time through its early modern Japanese clothing and architecture, but immediately connected through real-time data that creates shared experiences of weather and sun movements. Rather than a completely separate world, it's a world that we can come to understand as operating on the same principles as our own, providing a perspective on the contingency of our own urban surrounds. A word of caution is important here, however. The mechanism by which this contingency is modeled, namely data algorithms used to generate stochastic behavior along statistical lines, is a form of modeling closely linked to the field of cybernetics. Cybernetics, as developed by Norbert Wiener in his 1948 book, is the study of how complex systems, including humans and computers, can be and are regulated and controlled through feedback and communication systems. The core concepts of cybernetics were developed during World War II to help predict actions of the seemingly irrational behavior of the enemy, aka the Japanese, and an unstated tension remains in the field regarding the associations between Asian unpredictability as a population and mechanisms by which Asian cultures could be seen as antidotes to the supposed hyper-rationality of European Enlightenment. In the 1960s, cybernetics heavily influenced the emergence of media art, as artists like Nam June Paik became fascinated with the possibilities of using feedback mechanisms from cybernetics as a route to indeterminacy. As scholar Juan He writes, quote, "Feedback was about prediction, control, and efficiency, a way to determine meaning from an external world awash in chaos, to glean information from noise." For Pike, indeterminacy as an aesthetic concept challenged the information clarity of feedback systems within media technologies, using digital glitching, end quote. So in this context, a triangulation between Japanese culture, especially in the form of Zen Buddhism, as a source of indeterminacy and spontaneity, and this is in opposition to rational European Enlightenment, and then cybernetic modeling and regulation through feedback systems as a process for media-based art, and finally Japan as a site of high-quality technological production starting in the 1960s, became naturalized within technological discourse. So basically I'm trying to point to the fact that there is a certain sort of presupposition that there is some natural connection between these different ideas. If the fit between Japanese media forms, Buddhist cycles of change and indeterminacy, and digital worldviews seem surprisingly clean, they are to some degree baked into the emergence of digital media art as a field. But what teamLab's The World of Irreversible Change brings to this perspective is a link to the present through the synchronization of the digital Edo period model world and our present moment, pushing against reading the work merely as modeling of those inscrutable Japanese over there. Instead, the World of Irreversible Change uses digital algorithmic modeling and feedback to push towards a recognition of the contingency of our own built environment and natural environments, and the consequential nature of our individual actions when considered collectively, a reality made tangible by the changes wrought in the fictive communities depicted across the screens. Such recognition of contingency in relationship to environmental change has become a recurring theme since the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in Japan. And addressing such contingency through collective action has become a common working model in the socially engaged practices of Japanese artists, including Fuji Hikaru, Kyun Chome, Kato Tsubasa, and Chimpom from SMAPA Group, among others. Yet in teamLab's production, Collectivity looks more like an engineering or design firm, and collaboration with audience members takes place within the confines of the installation and not in the space of the initial design and production, as we would find in the more socially engaged practices. Such models of collectivity are more in line with the history of media art than collectives and collaborations in the broader Japanese contemporary art scene. Many of the best-known Japanese media artists participated in collectives early in their careers, based on a model of cross-genre interdisciplinary exchange and resource sharing. For example, Yamaguchi Katsuhiro was a founding member of Jiken Kobo, or Experimental Workshop, in the 1950s. Nakia Fujiko began her iconic fog sculptures as a member of the New York-based international collective Experiments in Art and Technology in 1970. Komura Masao debuted with Computer Technique Group in the late 1960s. And younger artists, including Ikeda Ryoji, Takatani Shiro, and others, got their start as a part of Dumb Type in the 1980s. Over here. Beyond the practical issues of resource sharing due to the high cost of much of the technology used in media art, such collectivity was also related to the ethos of many of these groups that operated at the edges of the fine arts scene, often exhibiting work in non-conventional spaces, from music halls and department stores to tourist centers, commercial showrooms, and rental galleries. Conventional museum spaces were oftentimes closed to media makers, especially in the early years of the genre, and so producing and exhibiting work as part of a collective offered the possibility of pooling resources, attracting larger audiences, and gaining press coverage. As many other commentators have noted, teamLab didn't receive so much attention in their early years either until a show held at Kaikai Kiki's gallery in Beijing in 2011, and this is a space associated with Murakami Takashi. Kaikai Kiki is his company. And Murakami Takashi used this space to showcase artists that forwarded his vision of Superflat as the intersection of art history with anime, manga, and other Japanese popular media histories. Yet teamLab's vision of collectivity also seems rooted in a transnational tech culture of the late 1990s and early 2000s that saw collectives like Spurse, up here, Jodi.org over here, and IOD over here, emerge from early internet chat boards, crowdsourcing strategies, and anonymous collective authorship, based on an early internet do-it-yourself culture that valued hacking and opposed institutional hierarchies, as well as in relation to a net art culture that eschewed conventional art media distribution channels. In some sense, the world, that eschewed conventional art institutional display in favor of new interactive sites on the internet, on computers, in public spaces, or through other media distribution channels. In some sense, the world of irreversible change is unusual in teamLab's oeuvre, created as in a simple, packageable form, compatible with more conventional practices of collectors and museums, despite its interactivity. teamLab's best-known works are immersive installations, and a significant number of these take place in convention centers, public parks, science museums, tourist sites, and their own specifically designed collective-run exhibition spaces, distinct from conventional art museum experiences. And this is sort of an example of one of the sort of promo video for one of these spaces. Collectivity from this perspective lets them push the boundaries of where and who interacts with their art, as well as how they interact with it, by situating these participatory media works outside of the space of the museum, namely a space laden with behavioral conventions and class associations. Like other net art and media art collectives, they're organized into interdisciplinary teams that allow them to bring specialist training from a variety of fields into their work. Unlike most such collectives, however, teamLab functions concurrently as an art collective and as an architecture and design firm, funding their more experimental projects with commercial commissions that use similar motifs, technologies, and approaches. While some projects clearly fall into one category or the other, there's no absolute hard line between their art and design projects, as is made clear by how several projects listed on their website under the architecture heading can also be found in the exhibition heading. Their physical headquarters as well convey the value that they place on both collaboration and working across disciplines by organizing space in flexible ways that accommodate different activities at different times. The scale of the collective leans towards the corporate, consisting of somewhere around 300 to 400 members organized into project teams. And while occasionally certain members are featured individually in interviews, more often the collective's representatives will remain anonymous, identifying themselves simply as members of teamLab. Such strategies reveal the depth of their vision of collective production, eschewing individual authorship, and of dissolving boundaries between disciplines like engineering and art history, between art and design, and between ostensibly distinct works of art. Indeed, as we can see in the World of Irreversible Change, characters from other projects, such as the dancing and processing animals from Walk, 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 Search, Deviate, Reunite. So these animals over here can be found in the World of Irreversible Change. Reappear on occasion in this world, adding an element of the fantastical also derived from Japanese art historical sources, while bridging the assumed distinctions between different works, namely Walk, Walk, Walk and the World of Irreversible Change. Much as elements of teamLab's artworks mix and mingle, blurring boundaries between works, they also visualize collectivity. The World of Irreversible Change depicts, as discussed earlier, urban space where bodies bump into each other and affect how each other navigates space. As the number of figures grow, the possible consequences of any one action multiplies. This is the principle by which large-scale and sometimes catastrophic change occurs across these 6 screens. The space of the World of Irreversible Change thus models for us what collectivity looks like, both in its positive and negative connotations, reminding us that we are always functioning in relation to each other. And this visualized collectivity of the World of Irreversible Change aligns with the collaborative experiences of teamLab's more immersive works. While the complex architectural spaces and kinesthetic objects, projection technologies, and computer algorithms that run their artworks are designed in advance, various openings are left within the work to allow viewers to complete each work. In some immersive works, visitors can place objects in a space to create town units in which animated vehicles and figures will move, and that's what you see here. In other cases, visitors can draw a figure on paper and scan their images in to be animated and interact with the existing projections. In most of teamLab's immersive spaces, visitors' own movements also influence the work. First by casting their shadows on the projections, but then also by triggering motion sensors and other kinds of sensors. Input from these sensors is fed into the computer system, generating the projection imagery, which in turn changes and shifts actions and conditions in the animation in response. Social critic Uno Tsunehiro notes that under these interactive conditions, viewer expectations are inverted. While another visitor's presence interrupting your view of something like the Mona Lisa, for example, might provoke annoyance on your part and induce museums to direct the movement of visitors to minimize such annoyances, in these immersive environments where interaction is impossible to avoid and is in fact actively rewarded by the projected environment's response, the presence of others instead becomes framed as play and collaboration. Movement is encouraged, potential divisions between visitors are overcome in the spirit of play, and we begin to imagine ourselves in relation to each other. There is a certain paradox in teamLab's practice. They rely on embodied experiences of interaction with visualizations of digital information to forge an idea of connectedness that transcends conventional divides between virtual and material worlds, human realms and nature, national and global communities, and even Earth and space. Yet the interfaces they create still have a materiality, and as I hope we've seen through this talk, play with the logics of physical media forms to alter our understanding of our relationship to the digital world. teamLab has stated that, quote, "The digital has liberated human expression from the physical. Expression no longer requires an irreversible bond to the material in order to exist," end quote. But I hope that in considering the dynamics of works like the World of Irreversible Change through the histories of urban media, change, and collectivity, you can see how their works argue slightly differently that, in fact, the digital has liberated us to re-envision the terms along which we relate to our material world. As the World of Irreversible Change shows us so distinctly, the digital and the material worlds, while not identical, are irrevocably linked, making tangible the ways ostensibly immaterial information and intangible social relations shape ecological, emotional, and material change in our worlds. Thank you.
take a few questions from the audience if you have them. Okay, sure.
Okay. First of all, I say this is some real cool exhibit. Something I like having my house. Just kidding. No. Seriously, what were the challenges that you guys have to face when you did digital artwork? You guys did something similar like creating documents.
Mm-hmm.
Was the challenge like time, cost? I know it's like.
Yeah, I mean, the way that teamLab operates in making their works, they really do rely on having large teams of people with different kinds of specialization. So they'll have people who are specialists in, they have some members who've gone through art school who have painting backgrounds, have art history, have design. Spaces. They have architects who design the actual physical spaces that they work in. So they really require a wide variety of different specializations and working collaboratively in order to create the kinds of very high-tech and custom-made kinds of installations that they produce. Yeah. What is behind that? There are a lot of questions about where exactly they came from, because in earlier paintings, before you start seeing these golden clouds, there are still mists and other kinds of cloud-like formations that are used to bridge spaces sometimes within East Asian painting, so both Chinese and Japanese and Korean painting. So why in Japan specifically did this gold cloud form emerge at that time? Part of it may have to do with, there's a lot of stories around Hideyoshi, one of the shogun at during this Warring States period, that he was sort of obsessed with gold and wanted gold everywhere. He had gold rooms, gold palaces and things. That that must have had some influence on it, but this arises before he's in control, so it's not clearly just about him. There are also moments in time where this term basara that was brought up it becomes popular in this medieval period in Japan, and then it's very quickly sort of replaced by a very humble aesthetic of wabi-sabi. So again, basara is very ornamental and influenced by Chinese sort of ornamentation on things like ceramics and in paintings, and so possibly it's not the same as what we see in China at that time, but maybe the idea of that kind of ornamentation led into it. But there are not like clear reasons for exactly why it emerged when it did, and in that particular form, that sort of flattened space that's very different from the kinds of mists and clouds that we would see in earlier paintings. Yeah. I assume, well, some of their earliest exhibitions were in China and Singapore, even before long before they had even their first shows in the US. And I think they generally have a following there. There's a larger sort of media art interest in the East and Southeast Asia region generally. I think a lot of times it's also about the kinds of spaces that they're in. They may be in, sometimes these are, some of the installations are found in different kinds of malls, large-scale malls, that we don't see a lot of malls with that kind of capital right now in the US. But you do find it in some of these larger urban centers, especially in Asia, or other kinds of sort of public spaces that have a lot of funding and want to become tourist sites. Part of it, I think, is that there's a lot of interest in finding ways of bringing tourism into different parts of the sites that I mentioned, like Singapore, Jeddah. These are all sites that are in the process of really bumping up their tourist industry. So I think that's part of it as well. Yeah, I mean these in teamLab it's a nod to the older form of the screens. In the older screens, it emerges around the same time as some of those shrines, and so it is sort of like in the air, that kind of aesthetic. Um, but the specific reason why it shows up on screens particularly, I mean, it's also, the other thing to keep in mind is, so screens at that moment are mainly made for aristocrats. They are oftentimes given as gifts, so it's nice to have it more decorative. You have a lot of pigments on there that are also very costly, not just the gold. They are objects that they're portable in a sense. You can fold them up, put them into a box, and carry them, and they were carried on ships. Some of them made it all the way to Europe as gifts, but they are at the same time still heavy objects. They require some amount of infrastructure to be moved, and so they are lavish gifts. So that's probably a big part of it as well. But yeah. It's hard for me to say exactly where I would see it going. There are kind of different threads within media art. There are people who are looking at questions of how. So you have groups like teamLab who are really focused on trying to figure out different kinds of interactivity through new technologies and developing new technologies. And of course, they're going to incorporate. I mean, I don't know if they specifically have a plan to, but I would imagine that they would be trying to incorporate things like AI as well into their emerging projects. But then you have other, a sort of another strand that's like critical media practice that is looking at how those technologies are implemented in sort of uneven ways across different populations. So those seem to me to be the two most robust strands of production at this moment, but there are a lot of other directions that people are producing as well, as they try and figure out what's possible on the sort of ever-changing platforms and the sort of move. I think another thing to keep in mind in terms of media art is there's a sort of crisis in museums right now about how to get people in the door, especially after the pandemic, because people got so used to the idea of being able to access everything virtually. And there is something about the interactivity of media art, especially works like this, like teamLabs, that does give a reason to come into the space. But the flip side of that is people will look at documentation of it and be like, oh, I can imagine how that works. So there's always, a push and pull between what media art can accomplish in terms of the sort of people it can connect with and the kinds of ways that it can develop new technologies. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of it is the larger installations are in these large sensors. They have lots of shorter term exhibits, and there are a number of those that have made their way to different places in the U.S. But they're short term, and they aren't as like comprehensive and immersive usually as what you would see in the spaces that they're running themselves. So it's a slightly different kind of experience. It's funny because they do, like, in some of the catalogs around their exhibitions, teamLab has mentioned social media as another site of interaction and a way that that people can find their own voice within the space in a different way. So not within the sort of prescribed, there are certain things that you can do within our program, but then also being able to bring in social media. But then, of course, the flip side of that is looking at someone doing something in a particular space tends to make people want to replicate that as well, right? So is it something that does give you, it gives people a new possibility for what they can do in that space, what kind of voice they can have, but does it fully liberate them? And there's always a limitation there. So it's pushing against one kind of limitation, but creating another one.
Are there any other groups you consider similar or contemporary to teamLab that are doing some sort of similar work?
Similar work. Not off the top of my head that I can think of doing similar work. There are a number of people who are doing different kinds of experiments with emerging technologies in interesting ways, biotechnologies oftentimes, and I think a lot of the artists that come to mind immediately to me are actually, they work in sort of multiple modes. They work in sort of a fine arts mode with more conventional media alongside emerging media. So I can't think of a group that I think works and functions in quite the same way as teamLab. But I think part of that is because it is, again, a large organization, and that kind of infrastructure allows them to do a lot of things that other groups are not able to because they don't have the same kinds of resources. And I kind of suspect that part of how it was able to coalesce the way that it did was because they weren't starting from a fine arts context to begin with. They were starting from training in engineering and technology and media and wanting to interact with art, brought in people who were more trained in the arts field as their collaborators that then became members, and then possibly that allowed them to rethink the structure of how they were working. Mm-hmm. I mean, where it could branch off to would, so the technologies themselves would be difficult to immediately replicate because they don't really, as I hope was kind of clear in some of my explanations, there's always an element of uncertainty about exactly how they function. I think that there is an artistic reason for it, but there's also just a practical reason of not wanting to have their work immediately replicated. But I think in terms of what people who are inspired by them could pull from their work, I think a lot of it has to do with thinking about how to create different kinds of interactive spaces, interactivity, thinking about what technologies you have at hand that you can use in different ways. And it's possible that, I said it's 300 to 400 people. They never really say exactly how many people, in part because it's constantly changing, because they have people who come in and out of the group. And I would imagine there will be people and groups that emerge from that, having worked on different kinds of projects, because like they do have the kids projects, they have these sort of subsections of the organization that specialize a little bit more in specific kinds of activities. And if they find that the direction of the overall organization is going a different way, they may decide to continue that particular line of production on independently. But I'm not totally sure what the best answer is to that question. I think there are a lot of possibilities for how we can think about what, I think the biggest thing that you can draw out of it is, so there's a lot of these immersive experiences that we've seen developing over the past decade in terms of art, the biggest ones being like the Van Gogh experience. And teamLab is very different from Van Gogh experience in the way that you interact. And I think that's what's sort of key to their ability to keep making these more and more of these immersive sites is that the frameworks that they're creating are much more open than the ones that are created in these other kinds of immersive environments. So understanding that part of the key to being able to draw audiences in and create a longer term project is to find more ways of opening up that space. I think that is something that a lot of younger groups can take from the group.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.